This is VOA News. Via remote, I'm Marissa Melton. Egypt is the host of this year's COP27 Global Climate Change Summit and planning to keep a tight rein on protests. AP correspondent Karen Chamas has more.
The Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh may seem like a picturesque location for this year's COP27 Climate Summit. However, behind the postcard perfect appearance, Egyptian authorities have created a tightly controlled fortress. Climate activists are saying the restrictions will limit their ability to protest and raise awareness of their cause. In a country where protests are virtually banned, the government has set up a specific venue for climate protests. However, no one is quite sure where it is. Notifications are required 36 hours in advance. This year's summit is likely to be a sharp contrast to COP26 last year in Glasgow, Scotland, where some 100,000 people marched through the streets in one of many rallies. I'm Karen Chamas.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will promise to speed up the UK's transition to renewable energy when he addresses the UN COP27 summit on climate change on Monday. Sunak made a last-minute decision on November 2nd to participate in the climate talks, reversing a plan much criticized by environmental activists and political opponents to skip the annual gathering. A Washington-based think tank says a train crossed from North Korea into Russia on Friday, 2 days after the United States said it had information indicating Pyongyang is covertly supplying Russia with artillery shells for its war in Ukraine. The think tank known as 38 North based its report on commercial satellite imagery. It said this is the first time such a train movement had been observed on the route in several years. Russia's veterinary service reported Wednesday a train had carrying horses crossed that border. VOA News. Children and sick or vulnerable people are expected to be allowed off a German-flagged rescue vessel by Italy on Saturday, but other migrants on board may be sent back into international waters, despite worsening weather conditions. The Humanity One, run by German charity SOS Humanity, and carrying 179 migrants, has been requested by Italian authorities to come to the port of Catania, according to the French news agency. The ship is one of 4 humanitarian ships off Sicily that have requested permission to bring those rescued to safety in Italy. So far, it's the only one that's been ordered to enter the harbor. U.S. President Joe Biden is on the campaign trail this weekend, stumping for Democratic candidates ahead of Tuesday's midterm elections. At a campaign rally for Democratic candidates in Illinois, President Biden said Democrats need to stay in control of Congress to protect new caps on drug prices and legacy programs like Medicare and Social Security.
It's a rock-solid guarantee, an ironclad commitment. Generations of Americans have counted on it, and it works. If we didn't have Social Security, the poverty rate for those over 65 would be 4 times what it is now. 4 times. I love those signs when I came in. Socialism. Just give me a break. What idiots.
That's President Biden speaking on Friday to a campaign rally in Illinois. Over 1,000 protesters marched through downtown Accra on Saturday, calling for the resignation of Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo amid an economic crisis that has hammered the value of the Ghanaian currency and seen fuel and food costs spiral to record levels. One protester who spoke to Reuters highlighted concerns about fuel prices.
He has failed, and we are asking him to resign. High fuel price increment is killing the people of Ghana.
The rate of inflation topped 37% in September, a 21-year high. Meanwhile, Ghana's currency has plummeted 40% against the dollar this year. Temperatures in Montreal reached an all-time high for November on Saturday. Montreal is the largest city in Quebec province. It saw temperatures exceed 23 degrees Celsius, beating the last record set for the month in 2020. Average temperatures normally hover around 8 Celsius this time of year, and already in October, temperatures were 2 degrees above normal. Human Rights Watch is calling on Brazil's President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to commit to concrete measures to back up his promises on the environment as government representatives gather for the COP27 climate summit in Egypt. Marissa Melton, VOA News.
This is VOA News.
Via remote, I'm Diane Roberts. A UN report warns of a record rise in sea levels as world leaders gather for a climate conference in Egypt. Envoys gather in the Egyptian seaside resort of Sharm el-Sheikh for a UN convention on climate change. As the UN's weather agency's annual report shows shocking new data, the sea level rise in the past 10 years is double what it was in the 1990s, rising by 2 inches per year. The worst flooding in Nigeria in a decade and the worst drought in 500 years in Europe. But the absence of 2 of the world's biggest polluters means many are doubtful the talks could result in any major deals to cut emissions long term. The United States is privately encouraging Ukraine to signal an openness to negotiate with Russia. The Washington Post reported as the U.S. State Department said Moscow was escalating the war and did not seriously wish to engage in peace talks. The newspaper cited unnamed sources as saying the request by American officials was not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table, but a calculated attempt to ensure Kyiv maintains the support of other nations. The mayor of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, is warning residents that they must prepare for the worst this winter if Russia keeps striking the country's energy infrastructure. Vitaly Klitschko says that means he cannot rule out residents having no electricity, no water, or heat in the freezing cold. He said Ukrainian workers are doing everything they can to restore services, but the public must prepare themselves. For more on these and other stories, please visit us at voanews.com. This is VOA News. On the final weekend before Election Day in the United States, leading politicians fanned out across the country to try to excite voters to get them out to the polls. AP correspondent Jackie Quinn reports.
Many analysts have said it depends on who turns out in force that will determine which party has control of Congress after the midterm elections. Vice President Kamala Harris in Chicago says Democrats have been keeping their promises to try to help lower-income families, a mandate given by voters 2 years ago.
When you vote, it's kind of like putting in your order. This is what I want from my country.
Former President Donald Trump, campaigning in Miami, says it's the border.
To stop the invasion on our southern border. It's an invasion, like a military invasion.
President Biden, his wife, former Presidents Obama and Trump have been on the road all weekend pushing for candidates in some of the key battleground races. I'm Jackie Quinn.
President Paul Biya of Cameroon is marking 40 years in power, but staying out of the spotlight as questions swirl around the 89-year-old leader. He's not appeared in public since French President Emmanuel Macron visited the Central African nation in July. Thousands attended a celebration in Yaoundé on Sunday, but Biya was not in attendance. Some think the president's son is positioning himself as a possible successor. Pakistan's former prime minister says a protest march towards the capital will resume Tuesday despite his being wounded by gunfire last Thursday. AP correspondent Naomi Shannon has more.
Speaking from his wheelchair in Shaukat Khanum Hospital, the ex-leader, who was wounded by gunshot in an apparent attempt on his life, called out to his supporters.
Judicial Commission जो सबसे पहले काम
He demanded an investigation into the shooting and the resignation of 3 powerful members of the government and the military whom he alleges were involved in staging the attack on him. Khan was ousted from office in April in a no-confidence vote in Parliament. He organized a march to pressure Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif's government to hold early elections. His protest march was peaceful until the attack, which killed one of his supporters and wounded him and 13 others, and has raised concerns about growing political instability in Pakistan. He has since been discharged from hospital and moved to his home in Lahore. I'm Naomi Shannon.
Israel's outgoing prime minister has issued a plea for national unity days after he was defeated in national elections by the former premier Benjamin Netanyahu. In a memorial ceremony for the assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, outgoing Prime Minister Yair Lapid warned of the deep divisions plaguing the country after the 5th election since 2019. From Washington, via remote, I'm Diane.
This is VOA News. Reporting by remote, I'm Joe Ramsey. World leaders and diplomats framed the fight against global warming as a battle for human survival during opening speeches at the COP27 climate summit in Egypt on Monday.
We need all hands on deck for faster, bolder climate action. A window of opportunity remains open, but only a narrow shaft of light remains.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the stark messages echoed by the heads of African, European, and Middle Eastern nations alike set an urgent tone as governments began 2 weeks of talks in a seaside resort town to figure out how to avert the worst of climate change. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley has attacked the developed world on climate conference's COP27 opening day, AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
Mottley tells delegates many leaders must take urgent climate issues much more seriously.
Not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve.
Mottley wants new funding mechanisms that would allow nations to address climate change much more effectively, calling for $5 trillion of private sector savings to be unlocked to stop the emissions of planet-warming gases. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
The U.S. has imposed its second round of sanctions in less than a week on people and firms in Africa who it says have provided financial or material support to the Islamic State group. The latest financial penalties target South African entities accused of expressing, quote, the will and intent to attack the interests of the United States. This is VOA News. Nigerian police have ordered the distribution of additional anti-riot gear, including tear gas and stun guns, to help maintain law and order in the run-up to and during the February presidential elections, a police spokesman said on Monday. Elections in Africa's most populous country have been characterized by violence, leading to the death of political party supporters and police and electoral officials. Nigerians will vote for a new president to succeed Muhammadu Buhari, who's to step down after serving the maximum 2 terms permitted by the Constitution. A Libyan military commander who once lived in the U.S. state of Virginia has been deposed in a U.S. lawsuit in which he's accused of orchestrating indiscriminate attacks on civilians and torturing and killing political opponents. That's according to the Libyan American Alliance, which supports one of 3 lawsuits against Khalifa Haftar. Plaintiffs have for years sought to question the commander of the self-styled Libyan National Army about his role in fighting that has plagued Libya over the last decade. Qatar's promise of a carbon-neutral World Cup raises doubt. AP correspondent Shelley Adler reports.
In building 7 World Cup stadiums and a new metro system, Qatar promised something else to distinguish this month's World Cup from the rest. It would be carbon neutral or have a negligible overall impact on the climate. But there have been skeptics, with outside experts saying Qatar and FIFA's plan rest on convenient accounting. One critic is Carbon Market Watch, which is a Brussels-based organization. They say Qatar vastly underestimated the emissions from building the 7 stadiums by dividing the emissions from all the concrete and steel by the lifespan of the facility in years instead of just totaling them. I'm Shelley Adler.
More than 42 million Americans have cast early ballots ahead of Tuesday's midterm elections, surpassing the numbers from 2018, the U.S. Elections Project said Monday. Americans will go to the polls on Tuesday to elect 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, and a host of state and local posts. Most of the 50 U.S. states allow voters to cast ballots early, either in person or by mail, a practice which became widespread during the 2020 presidential election, which was held at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Find more on these stories and the rest of the day's news on our website, voanews.com, or follow us on the VOA mobile app. Reporting by remote, I'm Joe Ramsey.